A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Let's get a focus today on some of the trends that are important in understanding the shape of our nation of Australia. Our population is growing and changing, and there are effects on our health and our employment and our livelihood. Well, Ashley Fell is back with us, a social researcher and director of advisory with McCrindle Research. She's a trends analyst and media commentator. Hey, Ashley, welcome back to 2020.
Great to be with you, Neil.
You know, we're only not far away now, are we, when the youngest baby boomers are going to be turning 60, and it just creates this image of an ageing population. Is this something that's important when you think of the trends?
Yeah, that's right. Australia, like many developed nations across the world, does have an ageing population. The baby boomers, as you mentioned, an incredible generation with incredible impacts and achievements, and they are the final generation in the generational span to span 20 years. Every generation after them spans 15 years. But I think also this ageing population does come from the fact that we do have, again, like many other developed nations, a bit of a declining fertility rate. So women in Australia are having children later in life and just in general less children. And we are relying heavily for our population growth on net overseas migration. So all of that does play into this idea that Australia's population is certainly ageing, which does have some big impacts for aged care, for the workforce, for the taxpayer base. So lots of different, facets and impacts of that demographic trend.
You mentioned the high migration rate that everyone looks at and is shocked at the numbers who are coming into Australia, but that's something of a symptom of things that need to be fixed because of our low birth rate. Is that the one way to look at that?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we have of course, a way of life here in Australia from different facets, from the economy to the social fabric to the infrastructure. And population growth is key to that. And prior to the pandemic, 62% of Australia's population growth came from net overseas migration. So I understand, of course, that when we see those migration numbers and we're maybe living in cities that are already experiencing some pain points around infrastructure and bottlenecks and housing affordability, some of these kind of flow-on impacts from population growth, that we can think migration is the reason for that, and it is part of that. But if we did cut the migration numbers down, we would have some implications there, because we aren't we're at below what they call the replacement rate, where people aren't having two children anymore on average to replace themselves, so to speak, two people in a family. So we would have some implications. So I think it's always about getting the balance right, that we're not growing too much too fast, which we have been growing pretty well in the last few years, but also that we need to be ahead of those numbers so that we can build roads and hospitals and all the infrastructure that we know and have come to rely on here in modern day Australia.
And of course, a high migration rate means that Australia is becoming increasingly more multicultural too, doesn't it? And that's got its own implications.
It does. The latest census results uncovered that about 27% of Australians are born overseas, which is really interesting. And of course, that has implications for language spoken at home. The other thing that's really fascinating, though, is when you look at the proportion of Australians who have at least one parent who are born overseas, that increases to almost 50% of Australians who have at least one parent born overseas. So we've got this great history and this legacy of multiculturalism here in Australia, and that is set to continue. But like you mentioned, it does have some implications for all the different cultures that we have coming here and moving here, and even their expectations of retirement and aging and multi-generational households. There's lots of nuance that comes with that. So I think being aware of that trend and the implications is important for us all as well.
Let's assume, well, I'm assuming, you can give us some details, but those new migrants who are moving to Australia, they're coming from younger generations, while you've got the baby boomers turning 60. You've got all sorts of implications when it comes to health and employment and livelihoods in all of that. I'm assuming that those new Australians are coming and they're in younger generations. Is there any detail on that?
Yeah, that's right. We do have quite a lot of younger people migrating to Australia, and also because Australia is quite a attractive place for people to kind of move and start their earning years, but also to study here. We get a lot of international students who study here and then kind of either stay on for a time or maybe move back home and then kind of try and find work here and migrate here as skilled workers. So that is a really big part of it. And that migration piece, therefore, is also helping to lower Australia's kind of median age because we've got, like you mentioned, older generations who migrated here many, many decades ago and whose parents were born overseas but who are now Australians themselves. And also the changing migration patterns post-World War II, European migration towards now more of an Asian-centric migration pattern. So we do have, young migrants oftentimes migrating here, which is lowering our ageing population and contributing to, more taxpayers and so lots of different benefits that come with that as well.
More taxpayers, that's clearly necessary when you've got an ageing population and baby boomers all going to be over 60. What does that mean for health in Australia? Because it means health budgets have to increase, employment is changing and lots of skills are being lost at the top end and hopefully replaced in the lower end. How do you reflect on those sorts of issues?
Yeah, it's fascinating to look at the health and aged care sector because like many others, like teaching is another one, but the health and aged care sector also has an ageing profession where we've got ageing workers. So we've got to attract new workers because we've got an ageing population, but also a lot of the workers in that sector will be reaching retirement themselves, so we've got to replace them as well. So we call it the aged care puzzle, where we're going to have increasing demand for that in the future because of a few different demographic kind of reasons. So I think it is about attracting and retaining workers to that sector, like you mentioned, budget allocation, also how we look after and care for older Australians and ease them into retirement and care as they get older. So, the proportion of Australians who are living longer is also increasing because we're increasing our life expectancy. It's amazing to see that for Generation Alpha, who are the current generation of children being born, they have a life expectancy of 81.3 at birth for males and 85.4 for females. And that compares to Australia's oldest generation, who are the builders, who had a life expectancy of 66 for males and 70 for females. So we've kind of added 15 years of life expectancy over a few decades. So, we are all living longer, and that means probably working later into our lives as well. And so we do need to, factor in a whole range of different implications for that. But particularly, as you mentioned there, Neil, the aged care sector and how we resource that is going to be a big issue, I think, for our nation in the years to come.
When you break down those generations, builders and boomers and Generation X and going down through Y and right down to Alpha, how do we look at the size of those cohorts in those generations? Is there something in there that's important for us?
Yeah, that's right. So Australia's currently largest generation is actually Generation Y. So that describes those born between 1980 and 1994. So they're largely in their 30s and 40s today. They comprise 5.8 million people. They're the largest, therefore, tax-paying base. They're the emerging generation of parents. The census showed us that they're also the generation contributing to the Defence Force here in Australia. So a really important generation to be thinking about. Not far behind them, though, is Generation Z, and then following them is the baby boomers. So, we've got some interesting kind of different generations, and we have this prediction that Generation Alpha will be the largest generation on the planet, but not here necessarily in Australia because it's more in the developed nations of the world where the total fertility rate is higher than here in Australia. So, we've got kind of Gen Y being the largest generation, followed then by Gen Z and then by the baby boomers. So, it's interesting to think about all those different generations and all the different roles and life stages they're in and how they contribute to the economy and society and the social fabric, and also being prepared for younger generations who are coming through, but then, as you said, and as we've been speaking about already, preparing for our older generations to, honour who they are and honour the work they've done. I mean, Gen Y, the largest population, but it's Gen X, the generation above them, that has the greatest proportion of full-time workers with many of the Gen Ys probably taking some time out to bear children and to do all of that with that life stage. So, yeah, at different generations, points in time, they represent different income levels and contributors to society and the economy, which is also all very interesting and important to be tracking.
Does it mean anything when we're talking about generations like this to the church in Australia? Have you got any reflection on the Christian church and the changing demographics there? Because obviously a lot of churches will say, look out over a sea of grey hair. Others in some churches are saying we're really vibrant, lots of young life in those. Does our demographic outlook look anything? What does it say anything to you as a researcher in your field around what the church might look like in the times to come?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. We've done a lot of research at McCrindle about the future of the church in Australia, and we believe it has a thriving place, but that doesn't come without some of the challenges that, like we've talked about with the aged care sector, like with teaching, and also with the average age of people attending church regularly is aging. A lot of, as you mentioned, despite some younger demographics in some churches, a lot of churches across Australia are telling us in our research that they do have aging attendees. And so the future of those organisations and those congregations does rest in, I think, attracting younger volunteers and younger attendees so that they can take on they can receive the torch passed on from those older generations who've done that work of serving and volunteering, so that we can continue to create, servivices and programs, Bible studies and all of the rest of it for the next generation. So, I think it is interesting as we think about Australia's ageing population. We do have an ageing church attendance population as well, and the younger generations are engaging with church and faith and spirituality in different ways. And even though what we teach them doesn't change, maybe the way we engage them might need to undergo a little bit of change to make the message we have, I guess, relevant for a new generation.
Well, Ashley, always love your insights into the changing shape and the look of Australia. Ashley Fell is a social researcher and director of advisory with McCrindle Research. She's a trends analyst. And you can connect with Ashley through McCrindle's at mccrindle.com.au, mccrindle.com.au. Ashley, thanks so much for sharing these thoughts with us today on 2020.
My pleasure. Thanks, Neil.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.